A winter afternoon in Heartland, Kansas, December 9th, 1998. A date that still lingers in my mind like the last chilling gust before midnight. I remember stepping out onto the porch of our weather-beaten house, scanning the endless brown stretches of tall grass prairie, my breath vanishing in thin wisps. The sky that afternoon started off an unforgiving blue, but there was something unsettled in the air. A raw cold only Kansas can summon, gnawing through old barn boards, rattling windows, making every dog bark and every old-timer grumble about the cold that gets in your bones. Out on County Road 12, close enough to see the smoke, but far enough from neighbors for no one to notice right away, a fire started up in the weeds. At first, most locals would have written it off. Just another careless burn, maybe some teens fooling around, or a farmer burning off stubble before the ground froze solid. Fires were a common enough sight during those long Midwestern winters, and as the wind whipped through, the scent of scorched grass carried through the town. No one realized anything was wrong until the acrid stench shifted, something darker, heavier, a scent that didn't belong in those fields. I always figured nothing much changed in Heartland. We had the same four-way stop on Main, the diner with its black coffee and pie, the old mill no one had gotten around to tearing down. But that night was different, in a way you can only see looking back. The investigation started when old Jim, a man too ornery to quit and too nosy to stay home, spotted the pillar of smoke from his pickup. With the sun already heading under and the kind of night where your bones ache before dinner, he went to take a closer look. I still remember his story later. Didn't expect to find a damn thing except burned pasture. But there was this shape half hidden in the grass, something my gut told me was all wrong. The sheriff's office was small, a yellowed linoleum floor, a battered radio, the everlasting scent of strong coffee and worry. When the call came in, they didn't waste time. Deputies pulled on parkas, muttered curses at winter, and took off down the icy road. What they found didn't resemble an accident, or even the kind of trouble you try to forget with a beer at the local bar. There in the darkening fields lay a body charred beyond recognition, features melted away, clothes fused to flesh. Next to the body, a black dog, its own fur scorched and twisted. Even for Heartland, a place with more legends than proper jobs, this was too strange. You'd hear stories on cold nights about ghosts, about restless souls, about darkness that clings to lonesome highways. But this was a crime, born of hate or fear, or maybe both. By next morning, the scene was blocked off, yellow tape shuddering in the sharp wind, and investigators poked through burned grass and old fence posts with more questions than answers. The only witnesses, a handful of scared cattle, the hollow prairie, and the prairie sky, turning purple and bruised with the coming storm. We didn't know it then, but nothing in Heartland would ever feel quite as safe, or as simple, again. Ghosts, black dogs, and the wall of silence stories travel fast in Heartland, especially when the prairie wind carries something strange down its long, empty roads. The discovery of the burned body next to the black dog shocked the town, but just as unsettling were the rumors that quickly slipped between the booths of the Main Street diner and the clinks of cups at morning coffee. That night, as the sheriff's office worked by the flicker of portable lights, people whispered about old legends, tales older than the broken barns and wind-beaten mailboxes. Heartland had always had its share of ghost stories. Elders liked to warn children about the midnight howls out on the prairie, describing shadowy black dogs that served as harbingers between this world and the next. Some said they were guardians of the afterlife, able to keep restless spirits from crossing back to torment the living. So, when word got out that the murdered girl had died alongside a black dog, gossip mixed with fear in equal measure. What did it mean? Had someone wanted to make sure her soul stayed silent forever? No one quite knew where myth ended and reality began. Hushed voices speculated that the dog's blood had been deliberately spilled, a ritual act meant to bind the dead. In some old country superstitions, burning a body with a black dog was supposed to imprison a vengeful ghost, locking her spirit in the liminal space where flame meets ash. Others muttered about darkness clinging to Highway 12 like a curse. Did someone in Heartland really believe these stories, or was the violence just another human cruelty dressed in superstition? Behind the shades of grief, a heavier silence pressed down. Neighbors grew cautious, doors stayed shut after sundown, and kids were called home sooner than usual. The families nearest the scene locked their windows and set their porch lights burning all night. In the quiet, people pondered if the evil that had come to Heartland was something new, or if, in truth, it had always been lurking at the edge of the prairie grass, just waiting for the right night to show itself. What bothered many most was not knowing. Who would go so far as to not only kill, but stage the dead with such intent, calling on old nightmares to mask something unspeakable? As the press arrived and outsiders briefly flooded the town, the sense of unease only thickened. Gossip grew, but so did the resolve to keep quiet. Nobody wanted to be the first to admit what they'd seen or heard. A wall of silence rose around the facts, the kind of stubborn small-town hush that holds back the truth for years, sometimes forever. Yet, in every town, there are always a few who still look out past the edge of the porch light, peering into darkness, wondering when those old ghost stories will finally become more than just stories after all. The messenger who stirred Missouri's John Miller had been a fixture in the county for as long as most folks could remember. Tall, silver-haired, with a face furrowed by time and all the prairie weather a man can withstand, he drove the local ambulance through storm, snow, and stifling summer heat. By 1998, John was supposed to be enjoying his partial retirement, driving no more than needed, content with slower days and an endless stream of black coffee at the Sunshine Diner. But fate had other plans that December afternoon. When the sheriff's office called down to dispatch, they needed a driver they could trust to move a body out on County Road 12. Something about a burn accident, maybe worse. John answered because he always did. For most of his life, he'd seen death. Old-timers succumbing to winter's bite, high schoolers mangled in farm equipment, an occasional overdose when hard times struck. Nothing had ever rattled him. Until that day. Rolling up to the scene, heat still lingering in the scorched grass, John Miller expected the familiar rhythms. The gentle hush that falls when first responders gather, the careful glance for evidence, the matter-of-fact notation of time and place. But what greeted him was like something out of a nightmare. The body, or what was left of it, had lost any sense of personhood. Every hint of face or identity was burned away. And then there was the black dog, not just a bystander or a casualty, but posed beside the woman as if its presence had a meaning beyond mere accident. John did his work with professional hands, but that didn't mean his mind could process it. The image persisted, stronger than any medic's stoicism could push aside. That night, and most nights after, he'd lay awake, listening to the house settle, and wondering if the burning wind outside carried more than just the sound of an ordinary Kansas winter. Everyone in Heartland had their ghosts, but John knew his were now tied to that roadside, to the silent gruesomeness that no one could explain away. Years would pass, and younger medics would take over his route, but the memory never faded. Sometimes, over pancakes and coffee, John would catch his reflection in the window and think of questions that had never been answered. Who was the woman? Did her family ever know she had vanished beneath that prairie sky? And why, of all things, had someone made sure her last witness was a black dog? Another soul gone missing in the winter wilds? John never talked much about it, but when folks asked about the coldest, strangest winter Heartland had ever known, they'd see something shudder in his eyes. I know, because for a long stretch I was one of those folks. We all carried the weight of what happened on County Road 12, and John, gentle, practical John, carried it heavier than most, proving that sometimes it only takes a single night for a lifetime's memories to tip from ordinary to haunted. A town cloaked in fear and superstition. After the harrowing discovery on County Road 12, it was as if fear itself seeped into the red-dusted cracks of Heartland's tiny main street. The town had always worn its superstitions like a battered winter coat, something patched together over generations, fraying at the edges, but never quite discarded. But this winter, an old chill returned. The mystery of the burnt woman and the black dog turned casual curiosity into collective paranoia. That week, locals locked their doors before dusk and left porch lights burning late into the night. Stories raced through the community faster than the prairie wind. At Rayburn's Hardware, a customer mumbled something about the devil's mark left in the singed grass. At the Star Cafe, the regulars swapped theories, voices low and glances wary, refusing to look too long out the frost-streaked windows. The town preacher quietly reminded his flock that evil thrived when good folks stayed silent, but even he looked anxious when the old legends began surfacing again. Whispers revived stories of prairie hauntings and omens handed down from Irish and Welsh settlers who believed that black dogs were sentinels between life and death. It was said that a black dog, killed alongside a lost soul, would trap a vengeful spirit and prevent it from returning home, an act intended to keep the community safe, but one that now made neighbors question each other's pasts and secrets. Several local families remembered tales of relatives who once swore they'd seen ghostly hounds roaming fence lines at midnight, their eyes shining like embers beneath a full Kansas moon. Children weren't allowed out alone, and parents forbade even the boldest teens from venturing near the scorched roadside. There were reports of strange sounds, barking in the distance, though no one dared check if any animal still lingered where the bodies were found. Even the ranchers, rough men who laughed at superstition in the daylight, made signs of the cross on their way to the fields. Mrs. Pearson, who lived closest to the crime scene, admitted to her daughter she hadn't slept through a single night since the day the fire was discovered. "It's not just nerves," she said over cracked lips. "It's something that's settled in this place, heavy as a blizzard." What deepened the unease was the growing realization that no one trusted anyone else. The silence was not just a mark of fear. It was the town's shield, an unspoken pact to protect themselves from outside judgment, or maybe from the darker truths within. In the market, eyes followed strangers just a beat, too long. At Sunday service, the prayers clung to the past, begging for deliverance not just from sin, but from the unknown thing that now haunted Heartland. Rumors flourished, stoked by grief, suspicion, and a gnawing worry that justice might never be found in a world where the line between fear and belief was as blurred as the snowy horizon. The nameless girl and the clue in her jacket. When the local coroner finally took the body away from that icy Kansas field, nothing about the charred remains gave up any easy answers. The victim's face was gone, erased by smoke and flame. Even her hands were too badly burned to offer up fingerprints. There's a particular loneliness that comes with investigating a murder when the victim arrives as a question, not even a name. But there was one small, stubborn clue, a melted tag still stitched to the remains of a synthetic winter jacket. Detective Charles Goodman, new to the Heartland force, but with the weary eyes of a Chicago transplant, spent that first week of the investigation bent over boxes of charred clothing and scorched trinkets. The jacket, once a puffy, practical thing designed to hold out the prairie wind, bore a faded logo from a small local shop. Millie's Western Wear, Hutchinson, Kansas. It was barely a clue, but in a town where people tended to buy local, the detectives clung to it like a lifeline. Goodman loaded a box of the victim's belongings into his battered Ford, and drove 2 hours to Hutchinson the next morning. Millie's was one of those family-run shops with faded signs, cow print displays, and a bell that jingled when he stepped inside. The owner, a 70-something whose eyes had seen generations of farmhands and their paychecks, met Goodman's questions with a mix of curiosity and small-town suspicion. "Yes, sir. We had a batch of those blue jackets," Millie herself replied, voice as dry as last year's corn cobs. "Ordered 'em in bulk back in the fall. Sold maybe a dozen before Christmas. Not many young folks buy coats around here unless they've got a reason." She prodded through her ledger, flipping past pages thick with down payments for boots and rodeo hats. Each jacket purchase, she insisted, was paid in cash, except one, sold to a young woman whose name eluded her memory. Dark hair, polite, but kept her hood up. Not from around here, I'd wager. Bought a size small, tried it on quick as a wink and left. Gave me chills, if I'm honest. Goodman took the ledger and began following the paper trail. He questioned diner servers, gas station attendants, the woman tending the library desk. Most waved him off with that Kansas stoicism. People pass through, don't always leave a mark. But a waitress at Floyd's diner remembered a quiet girl, maybe in her 20s, sitting alone at the window and writing in a battered notebook. She wore that blue jacket, I swear, up and left before I could refill her coffee. The search through the girl's scant possessions, burnt jewelry, a cheap silver ring, a broken chain, yielded little more. And yet the jacket became Heartland's singular obsession. For weeks, flyers went up in laundromats, on church notice boards, at the post office bulletin. "Do you recognize this coat? Did you know this woman?" But the silence stayed, so thick it rattled even the most patient members of law enforcement. For months, the woman's face haunted the town, unseen, but ever present, a reminder that beneath the surface of Heartland's winter calm, there were wounds that wouldn't heal until the truth was named. The police brought in a forensic anthropologist from Wichita. She spent weeks working with dental records, cataloging what fragments of the woman's clothing survived the fire. The world grows smaller with every thread, the hem of a skirt, the label on a faded pair of boots. She was young, probably no more than 22, she told Goodman, glancing up from her microscope. "Look at the stitching. These boots are barely a year old. Expensive, but not extravagant. Whoever she was, someone cared at least for her comfort. Or maybe she did, for herself." As Heartland fell into the rhythm of spring planting, the case nearly faded with the winter. Still, every week, Deputy Maya Cruz called the adjacent counties. Were there any missing girls? Runaway reports? It didn't matter if the face was blurred. Any story, any detail might be the thread that unraveled the whole tragedy. Then, months after that frozen night, a call came from an old thrift store volunteer in McPherson. "I saw the flyer with the jacket. I'm sure I donated one just like it last fall. Except I gave it to a girl who looked scared out of her mind. Wouldn't say her name. She came in just before closing, asked if there was a place to get a hot meal. I told her about the mission down on 2nd Street, but she said she couldn't stay." Goodman and Cruz followed the trail, piecing together a map of the nameless girl's last weeks, fleeting sightings in borrowed winter gear, rumors of her working odd jobs for cash. One motel clerk remembered her hands shaking as she handed over cash for a single night. "Never met her eyes," he recalled, "but she thanked me just the same." The clues stopped there, and frustration mounted. Forensics managed to recover traces of gasoline soaked into the jacket's lining. An autopsy revealed binding marks on the wrists. Someone had tied her up before the end. The case shifted from accidental fire to murder. But that jacket, burned, blue, still holding the ghost of its original owner, remained at the heart of the mystery. Word eventually arrived from the state crime lab, a partial DNA profile, not enough for a match. But hope flickered. Goodman sent the damaged ring across states, checking pawn shop inventories and missing persons databases. Always, the case swung back to that jacket, a second-hand garment, now the solitary voice for a forgotten life. In Heartland, January after January, the woman in the blue jacket held her silence. Some said she haunted the road where she died. Others left little crosses and wildflowers along the fence line every December. That coat still, in evidence, should be in a museum, Maya Cruz would say, half serious, half exasperated during coffee at the diner. No one's forgotten that girl, even if no one ever knew her name. And so, a jacket sold in a dusty Kansas shop became the thread binding a whole town to its own shadows, the symbol of a mystery no one would leave behind, and a cry for justice echoing quietly every winter since. Mysteries in dreams and a phone call from the past. 2 decades can pass in a place like Heartland, Kansas, and it might seem as if nothing has changed but the shade of paint on porch rails or the names lettered over the grocery store window. Yet even after 20 years, some wounds refuse to scab over, festering beneath the surface until the least expected event rips them open all over again. It was in 2019, on an autumn afternoon, streaked gold and cold, that the past finally called back to the Heartland police station, shattering every illusion of closure. They say small-town police stations are quiet places, haunted more by boredom than tragedy. That day, however, found quiet broken by the shrill ring of an old landline, the sort barely used anymore, except maybe by someone who didn't want to be traced. On the other end of the line was a woman, her voice soft but edged with nervous static, the kind that seems to have traveled through time as much as distance. Detective Charles Goodman took the call, expecting the usual. A complaint about a stray dog, a broken mailbox, lost livestock. Instead, what spilled from the receiver was a confession twisted not with guilt, but with an overwhelming, long-nursed fear. She introduced herself only by her first name, quickly, as if afraid she'd lose her nerve. "My name is Martha. I lived out by the county line years ago. I need to talk about what happened on County Road 12, a long, long time back." Goodman's heartbeat stuttered as he realized she meant the old case. He pressed her gently for more, sensing the struggle on the other end, as Martha assembled 2 decades' worth of nightmares into words. "I was just a kid," she started, her tone brittle with the trepidation of someone about to relive a nightmare. "But I saw things that day. I saw who she was with. I saw Emily. And I saw what happened. I didn't tell anyone, except my mother. We were both so scared. We thought, if we said anything, it would come for us next." The confession, coming after so many years, had roots not in a newfound bravery, but in an assembly of restless dreams. Martha recounted how, for years, sleep had not been a refuge, but a curse. Emily's face, flickering and half-lit by prairie flames, haunted her. In her dreams, Emily never spoke, but her eyes, wide with fear and sorrow, accused and pleaded at once. Sometimes Martha heard barking in the background, each howl blending with the Kansas wind. Other nights, the black dog appeared, ghostly and silent, standing beside Emily's ruined form, as if asking for justice in a language the living didn't understand. Martha's life had been stalked by these apparitions. She moved towns, changed her name, kept her circle small, but every December, as the nights grew long and the wind snapped across empty fields, the dreams returned more vividly, each time revealing fresh details, conversations, and gestures she'd tried desperately to forget. By the 20th year, the dreams gave way to something new. "Make the call," Emily pleaded, not in words, but in the longing look she gave from the shadows of Martha's mind. "Don't let them get away." There was something almost supernatural in the timing. The Heartland police, after years of dead leads, had nearly boxed away their files for good. But as Martha's story spilled out, a sequence of observations, childhood confusions, and sharp flashes of memory. A framework for the truth started to take shape again. She described how, on the day of the fire, she'd seen a group of older kids gathered near the edge of the field, some shouting, some whispering furiously. A blue jacket, distinctive against the dried prairie grass, caught her eye. She couldn't see everything. Growing dusk and distance blurred the details, but she'd never forgotten the tenor of fear in Emily's stance, or the aggressive postures of the others. She heard a dog barking, not a bark of play, but wild, pained, echoing across the fields. Later, after the smoke and after the running footsteps, she saw someone. She now believed it had been Becky, Emily's friend, wiping her hands on that blue coat, her face blotched and unreadable. The pieces Martha recalled were fragmented, filtered through the terror and innocence of childhood. But she remembered the silence that settled over her family in the aftermath, the way her mother insisted that, "Good girls, don't get involved in trouble that isn't theirs." For years, that advice was gospel. Now, after 2 decades of torment, Martha couldn't bear the ghosts any longer. Detective Goodman, listening in the amber glow of the office, realized the story's importance. His questions were gentle, steering, coaxing. "Did you remember anyone's names? Did you hear anything that night? Yelling, threats?" Martha's details were tentative, yet laden with the gravity of truth. They called each other by nicknames, Beck, Ann, Billy, Jack. But I never really knew them. I just saw what they did. After the call, Goodman sat in silence, the receiver cradled on his palm, the weight of 2 decades pressing down. He had what every cold case needs, an old witness with a haunted conscience, a shifting light in a field of doubt. The next steps were methodical, but suffused with the dread that comes from resurrecting a crime everyone had promised themselves to forget. Police began re-examining files, dusting off faded statements, searching for overlooked connections. Martha, for her part, agreed to come in, her testimony spilling out amid shaking hands and tears. The dreams had finally forced her to speak, to cross the boundary between passive witness and bearer of the truth, no matter how much it might cost her peace. Out in the town, as rumors spread of the police reopening the old case, new waves of anxiety rippled through Heartland. Old residents, who had long ago carved their own versions of the story in silence, eyed the shifting winds with a mix of hope and suspicion. Some were relieved. Perhaps finally, the girl in the blue jacket would rest. Others wondered what else might surface, what secrets best left buried might be dug up too. And through it all, the sense persisted that Emily's ghost, if such a thing existed, had finally been heard. Maybe after 20 long winters, she had found a messenger brave enough to cut through the wall of silence, fueled not by vengeance, but by the desperate need for peace. And maybe, just maybe, in the tangled web of memories, dreams, and confessions, the truth could find its sunlight at last. Reviving the case, nearly forgotten names return. When Martha's haunting confession finally reached the Heartland police, it was more than the reopening of a forgotten file. It was like prying loose a floorboard everyone knew creaked, but none dared step on. More than 2 decades had passed since that frigid day on County Road 12, and over time, the names and faces tied to that night had receded into the grainy distance of memory, half remembered, half suppressed. Like characters in a cautionary tale locals hoped would someday lose its hold. But Martha's testimony cut through that fog, forcing both authorities and townspeople to confront what, or who, might have been buried along with the past. Detective Charles Goodman, now a seasoned figure in Heartland's police department, his hair gone silver and his step a bit slower, felt a familiar knot in his gut as they pried open the old file boxes. So many documents were brittle with age, coffee-stained, and marked with hurried questions never answered. At the center were the four names Martha recalled through a haze of trauma and regret: Becky, Anna, Jack, and Billy. In 1998, they had been close-knit and restless teenagers, tied by friendship, tangled in rivalry, and bound by the kind of shifting loyalties that only exist in adolescence. Their names, scrawled in old reports, echoed on offhand remarks made by early witnesses, and dotted the periphery of a few yellowing Polaroid snapshots included in the files. Armed with a sense of duty sharpened by years of false starts, Goodman and Deputy Maya Cruz set about the painstaking work of locating the now-grown suspects. Each one had left traces, however faint, scattered across the prairies and small towns of central Kansas. Becky, who had once been the queen of local bonfires and Friday night tailgates, was now living in Emporia, working in a grocery store. Anna, rumored to have escaped the Heartland orbit for Wichita, had bounced from job to job, leaving more questions in her wake than answers. Jack and Billy had both relocated, one toward the Texas border, the other no farther than the next county, folding themselves into anonymous, ordinary lives, far removed from the suffocating scrutiny of their youth. The process of resurrecting the case was fraught with difficulty, not just from the logistics of tracking down people who had reason to stay lost, but from the ever-present resistance of the town itself. Heartland, after all, had spent years building a wall of silence around its ghosts. Knocking on doors, Goodman and Cruz found themselves confronted by neighbors with tight lips and wary eyes. Sometimes, it was as if everyone in town had sworn a blood oath of discretion. For each question asked about Becky or Anna, there were 10 responses of feigned ignorance, or a too-quick change of subject, uncomfortable laughter trailing off into strained pauses. But perseverance, and the cold weight of conscience, eventually began to yield results. Old teachers and churchgoers recalled fragments about the group, mentions of unspoken tension between Becky and Emily, odd behavior during the weeks before the tragedy, absences unreported or explained away. Cruz, ever patient, combed through high school yearbooks and alumni records, searching for connections frayed but unbroken, updating the team as she built out timelines that stretched from one Friday night in December 1998 to the present day. Parallel to the hunt for the four names, forensics got a fresh look. The evidence boxes, once left to gather dust, now became the center of department activity, their contents carefully catalogued anew. Goodman remembered the blue jacket and the partial DNA profile that had, years before, tantalized the investigation, but yielded no match. Now, with new technology and a revitalized state crime lab, analysts pored over every scrap for traces: hair, fibers, the torn note once found in the pocket of Emily's borrowed jeans. They ran the DNA against newer, more robust databases, including genealogy resources unavailable a generation ago. The process was slow, and the lab's waiting lists long, but each update raised both hope and dread throughout Heartland. As the net of the investigation widened, so did the circle of those drawn into the old story. Former classmates who once shrugged off the incident now fielded calls from law enforcement, their recollections coaxed by the passage of years. Friendships, marriages, and family ties shuddered as the possibility arose that someone they knew, or even loved, had hidden the most damning of secrets. Some refused to cooperate. Others, perhaps motivated by guilt, began to offer up long-suppressed details: Becky's erratic moods, Anna's nervous glances, Billy's unexplained injuries that winter. None of these on their own amounted to proof, but the patchwork of stories began to take shape, a tapestry woven from decades of rumor, regret, and reluctant honesty. As interviews continued, it became clear that the group's friendships, once unbreakable, had frayed drastically in the aftermath of the tragedy. Each carried their own brand of scars. Becky, according to a former guidance counselor, seemed haunted even before she left for Emporia. There was always a heaviness about her. She never really laughed again. Anna, when finally tracked down, broke into tears almost immediately, confessing to nights without sleep, living in fear that the truth would come to light. Jack and Billy, more guarded, denied everything but betrayed themselves with their siloed memories, painting timelines that contradicted, then overlapped in the oddest places. The small-town grapevine, insatiable and unforgiving, churned with new energy as word spread that the police were on the hunt. Heartland was suddenly awash with speculation. Everyone had a theory, a story, or a suspicion to add, yet no one publicly admitted to knowing anything. The concept of justice, so long dormant in town, now clashed with decades of self-preservation among residents who worried what consequences the truth might bring for their own kin or community. In a series of confidential meetings, Goodman and Cruz pieced together a working theory. The events that led to Emily's death, they surmised, involved a mixture of teenage recklessness, petty jealousy, and a spiraling moment of violence that no one intended, but no one stopped. The aftermath, bound by the collective dread of being the one who told, cemented the code of silence that held for years. Still, the investigation hit moments of deadlock. Leads fizzled as memories proved faded or deliberately false. Trauma, too, took its toll. Martha herself, now the linchpin of the reopening, struggled with doubt and survivor's guilt. She met with investigators in an anonymous conference room, her hands trembling as she recounted the sequence of events she'd witnessed as a child, every new question threatening to unravel her resolve. But her courage, and the work of persistent professionals unwilling to let the old ghosts rest, meant the case stayed open. In those long weeks, it seemed as if all of Heartland was holding its collective breath. Was justice, real, public, and irreversible, about to arrive in a place that had always feared its cost? Each development became a test of the town's willingness to face itself. Even as some still clung to old secrets, there was a mounting sense that something buried with Emily had at last begun to stir. The names nearly forgotten were spoken openly again, and with each utterance came the possibility that Heartland's longest winter was nearing its end. DNA. That fragile thread of justice. For 2 decades, the case was little more than stale rumors and cold files, just yellowed paper, faded Polaroids, and scribbled notes gathering dust in the deepest recesses of the Heartland Sheriff's office. People murmured about the girl in the blue jacket, the dog, and that barren field, but as winters passed and generations rotated through the same weather-beaten houses and wind-tilted barns, the ache of loss dulled into a kind of private myth. Justice, it seemed, was as distant as the horizon, shimmering just beyond reach, a hope too thin to grasp. But beneath that layer of resignation, tucked away in a battered evidence locker at the State Crime Lab, hope persisted in the smallest of forms. A sample labeled simply, Unknown Victim, December 98. It was a sliver of tissue, a charred core of bone, and the burnt remains of a faded blue jacket, all carefully sealed and catalogued, as if someone back then had believed, despite the odds, that science would someday catch up to the darkness that had swallowed Emily Lamb from the world. Heartland was not a place that trusted outsiders or change, but as forensic technology leapt ahead, kits were updated, databases grew, and investigators learned to think in genomes, not just gut feelings. Something shifted. In 2020, as the case was being quietly reviewed yet again, Deputy Maya Cruz drove 3 hours through driving sleet to personally deliver the old samples to the state's new DNA facility. It felt symbolic, almost sacred, the way she cradled the envelope, more nurse than cop, as though the tiniest misstep might erase everything that had ever mattered. The wait for answers was unbearable. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. Every so often, Cruz would call the lab, her stomach clenching as she left polite but persistent messages, just in case, nobody forgot. The staff on the other end grew used to her voice, picking up quicker, their tone softening as they realized what this meant, not just to the police, but to Heartland itself. "No news is still possible news," they told her, trying to instill patience. Deep down, Cruz felt she owed that patience to Emily and to her father, who wandered the highway verge each December with wildflowers, hoping for a sign. The call finally came late one rainy afternoon, crackling through a bad cell line. "We have something," the technician said, the words tight with guarded excitement. Against all odds, a single segment of mitochondrial DNA had survived the fire, resilient and stubborn. It wasn't perfect, not the crisp, courtroom-ready fingerprint investigators dreamed of, but enough, perhaps, to reach out into the database of the missing and find a match. They started with the national lists: runaways, cold case disappearances, families who'd never received answers. But the breakthrough came closer to home, in a battered manila folder labeled Lamb Emily. Years ago, her parents had provided DNA for comparison, refusing to let the world move on without her. Even as their hope grew brittle, they'd never asked for her to be declared dead. When the lab results came back, even the hardened staff members fell silent. The DNA matched Emily Lamb's parents. The girl in the blue jacket, unclaimed, unnamed, lingering for 2 decades in evidence boxes and whispered prayers, was Emily. The confirmation landed like a stone thrown in still water, shockwaves radiating outward from the lab to the sheriff's office, from police to the Lamb family, who received the call they'd privately both dreaded and yearned for. Alan Lamb, Emily's father, sat down heavily at his kitchen table and wept, his hands trembling over a photo of her smiling beneath a Kansas sky now forever changed. At last, there was no more pretending the girl might still be lost or wandering. She had been here all along, hidden by violence and silence, but never truly gone from memory. Maya Cruz and Charles Goodman struggled with complicated relief, gratitude for resolution, but pain for what had been confirmed. All the nights spent poring over files, staring at the blue fibers, wondering about the fragments. They had finally met their purpose. In Heartland, gossip raced ahead of official word, but for once, a rumor brought closure instead of confusion. The truth had a name. The forensic evidence, though elating in its breakthrough, carried a weight all its own. The charred blue jacket and the strands of hair tangled within became icons of both scientific triumph and tragedy. Cruz guarded the evidence room key like a talisman, reviewing the case notes countless times, challenging herself to hold the facts against the rumors, against the unbearable sadness that clung to everything familiar. But as the confirmation of identity made its rounds, a second wave of testing began. Modern DNA sequencing meant that more could be learned than ever before. The lab found traces of gasoline in the jacket's scorched lining, a deliberate act, not merely an accident of place or season. There were also fragments of skin not belonging to Emily, but to someone else, tiny clues preserved by the heat and dryness. Investigators leaned into these findings, cross-checking their database, re-interviewing suspects whose names had resurfaced thanks to Martha's testimony. One long strand of hair recovered from the coat proved critically important. Though badly damaged, it managed to yield a partial nuclear DNA profile that excluded many, but not all, of the original suspects. The lab turned to genetic genealogy, working with volunteers and building distant family trees, following leads that took them across state borders to relatives who'd once called Heartland home. Every discovery, every narrowed suspect pool, stoked both tension and hope in equal measure. The heart of the case became not just the tragic question of who Emily was, but the pressing, now unavoidable matter of who had done this to her, and why. As new DNA techniques whittled the suspect list, the focus turned sharper onto Becky and Anna, whose stories had always shimmered with omission and contradiction. When approached for fresh interviews, Becky's hands shook, her resolve grown brittle. Shadows flickered in Anna's eyes. Jack and Billy, Former friends once adept at hiding behind bravado found their timelines unraveling under scrutiny. A contradiction here, a missing hour there, strands of story fraying like the blue jacket's hem. Back in Heartland, the community felt the rough edge of science cut through the seamless fabric of myth and rumor. Families who had long believed the story was best left in the past now found themselves grasping for explanations. Some turned bitter, accusing investigators of digging up old wounds. Others felt a sense of dark vindication, the evil no longer abstract, no longer something to be explained away by hauntings or ancient prairie legends. It had a vector, a process, a nearly visible fingerprint. The day the final results came in, Maya Cruz went to Emily's gravesite, now marked at last, not by a number, but by name. There, surrounded by wind, she left a wildflower bouquet, whispering a silent promise that no evidence, no matter how fragile, would ever be forgotten again. For Heartland, the case of the nameless girl and the burned blue jacket would be told differently from now on, not just as a prairie ghost story, but as proof that even the faintest thread of DNA could pull the truth into the light, if only someone cared enough to look. A splintered confession and sleepless nights. Sometimes the weight of the unsaid threatens to break a person apart more surely than any punishment the law can mete out. For Becky Lawson, once Emily's friend and now a spectral presence at the edges of Heartland's narrow social circles, this truth drove her to restless nights and blurry-eyed mornings well into adulthood. Years after the tragedy that burned like a scar across the prairie, fragments of confession still clung to her lips, slipping free in moments when the world seemed too heavy to bear. It usually started at night, with a bottle of bourbon or a line of beers stretched across the sticky wood of whatever tavern she'd chosen to haunt that week. Heartland's bars were small and dim, thick with the scent of old smoke and stories best left forgotten. In the hush that follows last call, or amid the laughter pealing from a jukebox spinning songs from another lifetime, Becky would sometimes find herself surrounded by faces half lit in neon, her own looking back at her in the mirror behind the bar, older than she remembered, haunted, and hard. One winter night, as the wind howled down Main Street and snow rattled against the windows, Becky's resolve slipped. Slouched beside a sympathetic bartender, a classmate, or maybe a distant cousin, those distinctions blurred in Heartland, she blurted the words she'd carried like a secret wound. Emily's gone. We killed her, out there on County Road 12. It hung in the air between them, part confession, part curse. The bartender didn't understand at first. Maybe he thought it was just the drink talking. But Becky's eyes, wet and wild, told a different story. She rambled, halfway between sobs and laughter, about how none of them meant for things to go so far, how fear and anger boiled over that night until there was no turning back. We were just kids, she insisted. God, we were just kids. But we did it. We really did. After such confessions, Becky would always retreat into herself, shutting down, trembling. The bartender, unsure and frightened, said nothing, and the secret tethered itself more tightly around her heart. Back at her apartment, Becky's nights became wastelands haunted by nightmares. Sleep, once an escape, now brought only flashes of fire, her hands sticky with gasoline, Emily's terrified face, and the black dog barking somewhere on the other side of memory. She would wake before dawn, heart jackhammering, the bitter taste of fear mingling with guilt in her mouth. The room was always too quiet, too dark. She sometimes thought that if she just kept the lights on, maybe the dreams would leave her be, but they never did. In the cold, pre-dawn hours, Becky replayed the rituals of retribution she'd learned as a child, crossing herself, whispering apologies to whatever god might listen, promising to do better if only the ghosts would let her rest. But the past refused to be painted over by prayer or penance. She wrote hundreds of letters she never sent to Emily's father, to the police, to her long-estranged friends. The words always began the same. "Forgive me, I'm so sorry," but trailed off into ink blots and smudges. It was as if language itself had abandoned her in the dark. There were brief, flickering hopes that she might find absolution by confessing openly. Sometimes, when dawn crawled across the snow outside her blinds, Becky rehearsed what she might say if she ever stood in a courtroom or before Emily's grieving family. "I did it. We all did." But every time daylight found her, that courage faded, replaced by the same paralysis that had defined her since that long-ago December. She feared the wrath of Heartland, the ruin of reputations, but most of all, she dreaded being shunned by the only people left who still claimed to remember her at all. Word of Becky's drunken confession did, in time, ripple quietly through the town. Becky says the damnedest things after a few. They gossiped at barbershops and gas stations, nervous laughter masking the undercurrent of dread. Maybe someone finally relayed the story to the new sheriff, or maybe it was just absorbed into the tangled web of rumors swirling since the investigation had been reopened. But Becky herself felt no relief. If anything, the telling made her feel more naked, more raw. It was one thing to hold a secret alone. It was another to realize it was out there, infecting the air she breathed. As investigators circled closer, interviewing old friends and combing the burnt soil where Emily's grave should have been, Becky's shame and panic mounted. She started seeing Emily everywhere, in a stray's reflection on a rain-streaked window, in laughter echoing through the empty diner, in dreams where time looped endlessly back to the moment before everything went wrong. She wondered if the only escape from this cycle was to finally lay everything bare. The anxiety was physical. Some days, Becky couldn't eat, her stomach tied in knots of dread. Other days, she wandered Heartland's back roads in her pickup, radio turned up just loud enough to drown out the questions hammering in her chest. Sometimes she parked by the edge of County Road 12, staring out at the tall grass until her eyes burned. She would mutter, "I'm sorry, Emily. God, I'm so sorry." The wind carried her words away, leaving her emptier each time. The very architecture of Heartland became complicit in her guilt. She couldn't walk anywhere without feeling watched. In the market, someone's gaze lingered too long. At church, every prayer for the lost was a knife twisting deeper. She tried to keep to herself, ignoring the phone calls and knocks at her door, but the silence was as sharp and dangerous as the whispers. When at last the law came for her, a quiet visit followed by days of mounting pressure, Becky was almost relieved. She broke down quickly under questioning, the years of repression and insomnia fracturing in a storm of sobbing and apologies. She told them more than she had meant to, about her fears, the pact of silence among the teenagers, her belief that telling the truth might be the only way to ever sleep through the night again. Yet, even after her official statement, Becky's insomnia remained. There are wounds in the soul that no sentencing or confession can heal. Heartland, too, struggled with that lesson. For every piece of evidence unearthed, for every fragment of truth finally spoken, there remained a shadow, a sense that justice, even when served, was a cold and comfortless thing. In the end, Becky was left with her sleepless nights, haunted not by the threat of judgment, but by the memory of a girl who'd never get to grow old, and by the knowledge that some secrets, once loosed, never really stop echoing through the dark. A father's final words and grief beyond language. Alan Lamb, Emily's father, was never a man of many words. He had come to Heartland decades ago as a young immigrant, chasing the American promise across oceans with nothing but hard hands and bigger hopes. Over the years, he built a life from scratch, working sunrise to sunset in cold warehouses and dusty flour mills. His English was slow, deliberate. heavy with the care of a man determined not to make mistakes. For a long time, people in town saw Alan as a quiet presence, the sort of neighbor who waved from across the fence, but never lingered over coffee at the diner. They nodded as he passed with his lunch pail, rarely thinking about the proud daughter who once helped run their farm stand every summer. Even now, years after the truth came out, Alan could still hear the last words Emily had spoken to him, a murmured goodbye, hasty and half angry, as she stormed out on a freezing December morning. Every sound of her boots on the icy porch, every slam of the battered front door, replayed in his mind each night as sleep eluded him. Alan's grief was not the kind you could share at church suppers or bottle up into a tearful toast. His was private, sewn into the seams of old shirts, wound tight in the calluses on his palms, salted into the soil he still worked alone. The years that followed Emily's disappearance hollowed Alan in slow, quiet ways. When the news finally arrived, the match, the DNA, the proof that his daughter had died so cruelly, so near home, left nameless and unsheltered, it hit with the violence of a storm. He barely remembered the phone call, only the way his world had blurred at its edges, leaving him stranded. The police offered words in careful English, but all Alan really heard was that Emily wasn't coming back, that the search that had driven him through sleepless nights and winter storms was over. Neighbors tried to comfort Alan in their own ways, with food left on the porch, envelopes of church donations, murmured prayers, but their offerings met only the blank windows of his silent house. Alan became a fixture on the shoulder of County Road 12, returning each December with a fistful of wildflowers, never store-bought, always picked from the untamed fields where local kids once played. He'd stand, coat flapping in the wind, eyes straining over the prairie, sometimes whispering in his native tongue, sometimes in the English he had worked so hard and long to master for her sake. On the first anniversary, Alan wrote a letter to Emily, a letter he never sent, never showed anyone. He simply laid the folded paper at the fence line, weighed down by a stone. The words were ordinary, heartbreakingly so, a list of everyday hopes, the wish that she would come home safe, that she would forgive his stubbornness, that she might remember how proud he had been when she brought home her first report card, or helped him fill baskets at the market every Saturday. He recounted his regrets in quiet confessions. He had been too strict, too slow to adapt. He had poured all his hopes into Emily, not knowing that their little family could splinter so easily beneath the pressures of two cultures, two languages, two wildly different worlds. In his mind, he begged for her forgiveness. "I did not protect you. I am sorry, daughter. I am always waiting." When authorities finally returned the remnants of Emily's possessions, a burnt silver ring, the charred tags from her jacket, Alan accepted them, fingers trembling as he held the pieces of a life lost too soon. Sometimes he would smooth a scrap of fabric between his hands, murmuring old stories, the kind he'd meant to pass down, but never found the words for, until it was too late. Grief, Alan discovered, is a language with no translation. His sorrow was not loud or public. He refused the press, turned away from cameras, and found he could not utter her name without risking collapse. Instead, Alan moved through Heartland with a deliberate gentleness, tending flowers at the grave the police erected once Emily's identity was confirmed. He talked to her there, sometimes about the weather, sometimes about how he found himself reaching for a second dinner plate out of old habit. There were days when he simply sat in silence, letting the wind say what he could not. In the years since Emily's name was restored, Alan became the silent heart of the town's collective mourning. Children learned to speak softly as they pedaled past his house. Strangers brought food in the summer, or left candles at the spot along County Road 12. Alan never asked for sympathy. He hadn't moved to America for pity or handouts. But slowly, He came to represent every parent who had ever lost a child to the vast, indifferent world. Sometimes, at town meetings or quiet evenings at the local market, Alan would be approached by those who remembered Emily, a teacher, a classmate, someone who had admired her smile. They never asked him about justice or how he lived through the long, empty years. They asked only if he remembered the girl she was, as if by keeping that image alive, they could press back the shadow that settled over them all. There were days when anger threatened to break through Alan's stoicism. He struggled to accept that the ones responsible would serve only years for Emily's death, that the machinery of law could never fill the space she had left. The sentence, though called justice, felt light as dust against the enormity of his loss. Alan sometimes wondered if healing was even possible, if forgiveness was something he was meant to offer, or simply to hope for, far down the road, on a day when the prairie wind finally softened. His sorrow also left room for hope, fragile as it was. With each passing year, Alan planted a new sapling at the edge of the fields, telling himself that as long as something took root, memory and love would persist beyond violence, beyond forgetting. He started keeping a notebook, filled not with stories of loss, but with memories of Emily's laughter, her stubbornness, her dreams of the world beyond Kansas. Even though he wrote in 2 languages, some words never quite fit. The ache remained unspeakable, but the act of writing kept him company in absence. On the winter's longest nights, Alan still dreamed of her, sometimes as a child, sometimes standing in the twilight, hair caught by the wind, always looking back as if just about to speak. In these dreams, dialogue was unnecessary. The love and regret flowed between them, mingling in the prairie dusk. He would wake in tears, then rise to light incense and say, a quiet prayer, an old tradition from a homeland his daughter never fully knew. When asked, rarely and with great caution, if he could ever find peace, Alan's answer was always honest, never cruel. Grief, he would say, does not end, but it gets quieter. I do not forget, but I choose each day to keep going. For her, for me. And then he would smile, soft, enduring, the kind of smile that gathers years and sorrow and lets them rest for a moment in the stillness of the prairie light. Justice delayed, grief unending. When the gavel finally came down in the Heartland case, the sound was at once resonant and hollow, a thunderclap for a storm that had long ago washed out the roads and left only lingering mud. For over 2 decades, Emily Lamb's case had hovered at the intersection of crime and folklore, a haunting presence more often whispered about than faced head-on. The wheels of justice, notoriously slow in small towns burdened with fear and loyalty, had at last finished their circuit. But no one, least of all her father Alan or the patchwork community that called Heartland home, found that the verdict brought the closure they had imagined. The investigation, once a cold file sealed by time and silence, only clawed its way back to the surface because scientific persistence and fragile witness testimony converged at just the right point. The arrests arrived like a prairie squall, sudden and public. Becky and Anna, now adults chasing their own fractured lives, were led out of their apartments by state detectives on a freezing Thursday morning. The local paper captured the moment. 2 women, faces set and eyes sunken, shepherded past flashing cameras and silent neighbors. Their mugshots landed above the fold, beneath headlines that seemed to apologize for running such pain in public view. Inside the courthouse, the mood was one of grim anticipation. Alan Lamb attended nearly every session, his presence steady, sometimes so still he seemed carved from the old wood of the receiver's bench. Each time the accused entered, shuffling in chains, Alan simply bowed his head, never glaring, never acknowledging their existence, holding his grief with the dignity of a man unwilling to break in front of strangers. The prosecution painted the bleak details with clinical precision. They retold the story of a girl's betrayal, the violence on County Road 12, and the agonizing, muted aftermath. They showed the jury the blue jacket, charred and pitiful, passed through gloved hands as if it might still burn. Forensic experts explained the delicately preserved DNA, while witnesses relayed memories warped by years of guilt and rumor. The defense, for its part, leaned heavily on youth, intention, and regret. The defendants had been teenagers, the crime an unintended result of adolescent fury and fear. Yet, even as the truth unfolded, heartbreak twisted around every admission. Becky confessed in low, trembling words how the night spiraled. A confrontation turned struggle, a fire that was supposed to be a warning, not a funeral pyre. Anna echoed, her voice devoid of pride or hope, that she wanted to stop, but didn't know how. Both begged the court for mercy, for recognition of remorse too long left unsaid. Their faces, masked by years of insomnia and anxiety, bore little resemblance to the high school portraits clipped into the case files. The sentences, when passed, reflected the gray expanse between crime and childhood misjudgment. As minors at the time, both women faced only partial responsibility under the law. 14 years, less than the lifespan of some prairie dogs, was all the justice the system could offer. The day the clerk read out the punishment, Heartland fell as silent as a stopped clock. Some in town muttered, "It's over. Let it be." Others, especially those who remembered Emily as more than a headline, felt something akin to sickness. They saw no satisfaction in the outcome, only the inexorable thinning of hope that justice could ever balance so much loss. For Alan, the sentencing arrived not as a gift, but a blunt fact. He sat, unmoving, as the courtroom emptied, his hands folded. Later, those who spoke to him reported only a gentle handshake, a simple, "Thank you for trying." He did not attend any press interviews, nor did he join the community in post-trial gatherings. His steps seemed heavier, his silences deeper, the kind of hollowness that comes after all words are spent and all tears have run dry. In Heartland itself, reactions fractured along familiar lines. The older generation, wary of outsiders and public scrutiny, resented the intrusion and wished nothing more than to return to quiet routines. Younger townspeople, some of whom had grown up with the case haunting the periphery of their childhoods, posted online about trauma and the long shadow of violence. A few took solace in the conviction, if not in the length of sentence, then in the simple act of naming the crime and its perpetrators. Others decried the limitations of a legal system that, however fair on paper, seemed built for lesser wounds. Grief remained the true legacy of the trial. It radiated outward not only from Alan's home, but from every parent who had ever worried about a child on a cold winter night, every classmate who remembered a joke or a smile on a day before Emily vanished, every volunteer who had raised flyers in the wind, fingers numb with the hope that missing did not mean gone forever. People found themselves visiting County Road 12, now changed forever in meaning. Some still left flowers. The makeshift shrine persisted, maintained each season by hands that sometimes shook with age, sometimes with memory. The wild prairie grew taller and thicker, but the imprint of what happened could not be overtaken by time or by nature's slow reclamation. Justice's arrival, years too late, felt less like a door closing and more like a window forever, stuck half open. Residents wondered how to teach children about right and wrong, about secrets and responsibility, when evidence could be so difficult, when pain persisted so visibly. Church suppers fell quieter. Local festivals struggled to summon their old enthusiasm, and even daily gossip seemed more circumspect. Heartland's wounds were now visible, mapped across sidewalks, memorial services, and the fading paint outside the only grocery store still open on Main Street. In private, Alan wrote to his daughter, as he had every December since her death was confirmed. His letters grew shorter, not for lack of memory, but because so little of significance seemed left to say. He listed the names of her childhood friends, the new kinds of flowers now blooming in her absence, the changes to their old neighborhood. Occasionally, he wondered aloud whether forgiveness, so often described by neighbors and preachers as a destination, might better be experienced as a journey, one he did not expect to complete. What justice had come was, in the end, uneven. It granted titles, punishments, and a hastily chosen sense of resolution that could not fill the emptiness left by Emily herself. The court documents joined the growing stack of artifacts left behind in the wake of her life. A blue jacket, a silver ring, a handful of photographs no longer fading, now digitized and preserved for a future that would never know her smile in person. Heartland might have wanted to forget, to invite spring rains to wash away the remnants of a tragedy that ran deeper than any headline could record. But as long as the wind howled over County Road 12, as long as people remembered, and as long as justice continued to feel like a brittle, belated visitor, grief would stand watch, patient and unyielding, reminding all who remained that closure is a myth and loss is a story that keeps on telling itself year after year. An open ending, reckoning and fragile hope. In the wake of the trial and the long-delayed sentences, Heartland settled into an uneasy quiet. The cycle of seasons continued. Frost glittered along the rooftops in winter. The prairie grass waved gold with the first warm winds of spring, and life in the town ground forward, slow but relentless. Outwardly, everything seemed almost normal, as if loss and justice were just rumors echoing through the grain elevators. But beneath that veneer, something essential had shifted. A reckoning so profound that even the air felt different. The scars of Emily Lamb's tragedy did not simply heal with verdicts read in a courtroom. For many, the sensation was like standing at the edge of a wide, dark field. The familiar landscape unchanged, yet charged with meaning only those who had walked through grief could understand. There were days when Heartland felt haunted, as if every porch swing and grain silo remembered what had happened, and every shadow stretched a little longer on account of the secrets finally brought. Into the half-light. Living with the aftermath. Alan Lamb, Emily's father, went through the motions of daily life with a new gravity. Old friends noticed that his hair had grown grayer and his shoulders stooped, but his presence at the market or along County Road 12 never diminished. Occasionally, townspeople would spot him tending the wildflowers along the roadside memorial, kneeling in the grass as if searching for something words could not reach. He rarely spoke of the sentence, or of the young women who'd been convicted in his daughter's death. For him, justice lived side by side with absence, each day beginning with a memory and ending with a kind of prayer. Others in Heartland carried their own burdens. Maya Cruz, the deputy who had refused to give up on the DNA evidence, often found herself lingering at her office's cramped evidence room, fingers brushing the battered blue jacket, eyes tracing the labels on the boxes lined along the shelves. She wondered if the small victories of closure were enough, or if some wounds simply made space for hope to persist. Hope not for satisfaction, but for something like understanding. Her dreams still carried the scent of scorched earth and prairie wind. Families who once whispered rumors or shielded their children behind locked doors now found those same doors swinging open to let in the future. Some hesitantly reached out to the Lamb family, cooking meals, sharing condolences, picking strawberries in Emily's memory during the summer. Yet for each gesture of solidarity, there was a lingering sense of vulnerability. The realization that evil and folly were not strangers, but neighbors, always capable of surfacing even among the most familiar faces. The town's reckoning. At Heartland School, teachers reworked lesson plans to discuss empathy, responsibility, and the consequences of silence. Counselors checked in on students whose families had been touched by the tragedy, while administrators debated how to teach about justice without reopening wounds. The local pastor spoke at length about forgiveness, inviting the congregation to light candles not only for Emily, but for every lost child, every member of the community hurt by secrets kept too long. Still, some lingering bitterness pervaded the edges of Heartland. The parents of Becky and Anna struggled with the dual roles of supporters and silent outcasts. There were those who blamed the town, those who blamed the families, and those who blamed themselves for not seeing beneath the surface. More than once, arguments flared at the diner, the debate surfacing. Was 14 years enough? Could the justice system ever truly understand the price of a silenced life? Old friends of the convicted wandered the streets uneasy, sensing a fault line running through relationships that once seemed solid as bedrock. Some tried to move away, seeking the anonymity and new beginnings of distant cities. Others, unable to leave the ghosts behind, returned again and again to the places where innocence had been lost. For these survivors, healing was not a matter of time or verdicts. It was a negotiation with memory, a day-to-day attempt to forgive themselves for simply surviving. Fragile threads and faint light. Yet, if you looked closely, a different kind of hope tugged at the edges of the pain. The memorial along County Road 12 became a gathering ground for quiet acts of remembrance. Every December, even in the bitter wind, people left wildflowers, faded photographs, and handwritten notes at the fence. Teenagers who had never met Emily sometimes stood in silence before the shrine, contemplating mortality and cruelty in a place usually reserved for first kisses and tall tales. The story became a warning, and also a call for accountability. Parents told their children about Emily, urging them not to keep secrets, not to let fear silence what mattered. Artists and writers drew inspiration from the case. Local musicians performed charity concerts. The community theater staged a play that, without naming names, challenged audiences to recognize humanity on both sides of a tragedy. The old wall of silence crumbled, not all at once, but brick by brick, as people found courage to share and to listen. Alan, in his quiet way, began inviting students from the local high school to help him plant native grasses by the roadside. Life grows, even where there is loss, he would tell them, his accent infusing the words with gravity and kindness. Some days he would find letters tucked beneath his front door, apologies from former classmates of Emily's killers, poems, even drawings by children who wanted to brighten his window. It never fixed the ache, but it proved that wounds could be acknowledged, and that community meant more than bloodlines or Sunday greetings. A future uncertain, yet no longer unspoken. For Maya and her colleagues in the sheriff's department, the case changed how they saw their role in Heartland. They continued to follow up new reports of missing persons with diligence and empathy, determined not to let another tragedy become invisible. The success of the DNA match became an emblem of perseverance, proving that even cold cases could someday thaw if hope and technology advanced hand in hand. State investigators reached out to other rural towns, sharing lessons and procedures refined in Heartland as a model for tackling long unsolved crimes. Not all questions found answers. Jack and Billy, never formally charged but forever shadowed by suspicion, drifted through their adult lives, unable to shake the weight of secrets only partly unearthed. Rumors persisted, sometimes growing with the telling, sometimes waning as new generations pushed old horrors deeper into myth. But there was a new honesty in the town's conversations, a collective decision to keep examining uncomfortable truths and not to let time bury what justice had left exposed. Most importantly, Emily's voice, once silenced, reduced to rumor and conjecture, now lingered in the living stories of Heartland. Her classmates, once afraid to remember, organized scholarships in her name and created safe spaces for students to speak about fear, loss, and longing. The blue jacket, preserved under glass in the local museum, became a symbol not just of violence, but of the fierce love required to keep memory alive. An ending, or something like it. And so, Heartland reached its open ending, justice formally served, but grief and uncertainty refusing to be confined. Life continued, scarred, but enduring. Those touched by the case, by proximity, by love, or by tragedy, learned that closure was not a single event, but a collection of choices. To tell the story, to remember the victim, to refuse to mistake silence for peace. On the anniversary of the sentencing, Alan walked out to the roadside where Emily's life and the heart of the town were forever changed. He laid wildflowers next to faded photographs and looked out across the fields where wind bent the tall grass in endless patterns. In the measured stillness of the prairie, he whispered, in his first language, and then in English, words meant for his daughter, and perhaps for his wounded community. Let us plant hope here. Let it take root beside the sorrow. Let something good grow, even if we never see it flower. And among the muddy wheels of farm trucks and the laughter of children resilient to history's ghosts, you could almost feel that hope, fragile and slow, beginning its work in Heartland at last.